Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are very excited. Before we get started, we would also like to note that as a land grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. We are currently in the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, the Wea, the Miami, the Mascouten, the Odawa, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. We are so very pleased to have Professor Adrian Johns from the University of Chicago speaking to us tonight. I'm a huge fangirl. I'm so excited he agreed to do this with us. He has authored dozens of articles and papers in the history of science, the book, media, and information. His first book, The Nature of the Book, won the Leo Gershoy Award of the American Historical Association, the John Ben Snow Prize of the North American Conference in British Studies, the Louis Gottschalk Prize of the American Society for 18th Century Studies, and the Sharp Prize for the best work on the history of authorship, reading, and publishing. His second book, Piracy, The Intellectual Property Wars from Gutenberg to Gates, won the Lang Prize and was selected as Book of the Year by the American Society for Information Science and Technology. Johns has also been awarded the Guggenheim, ACLS, and NEH fellowships. Tonight, he will be presenting some of the research contained in his most recent book, The Science of Reading, Information, Media, and Mind in Modern America. And if you are local, our local Barnes & Noble also has a nice little display of those books for sale if you want to go check it out. Also available wherever books are sold. Adrian, thank you so very, very much for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
No, well, thanks, Kate, and thanks, Carrie, and thank you, everybody, for tuning into this. Suddenly occurs to me maybe tuning in is not what one does to a webinar, but you know, the digital version of tuning in. So thank you. Yeah, so I want to talk about the science of reading, which is a phrase that many of you who are parents, I suspect, will have come across quite recently, because the last 3 or 4 years, a number of legislatures in the United States have been mandating certain ways of teaching reading to young children based on the claims of a science of reading that's largely neuroscience based on things like fMRI scans and stuff. And which claims to have solved debates about the nature of reading and how you teach it that really go back decades to at least the 1950s and maybe beyond that. Now, I may come back to that version of the science of reading when I end, but for the most part today, I want to go back to earlier decades, because the science of reading that's invoked today in these debates is actually the heir, the legatee to an older science of reading that really, I think, framed how much of American information culture works to this day. And in fact, one of the ironies of the current legislative fad is that the new science of reading is replacing something that it was not like just superstition or error, but it was based on the previous rigorous science, which ought to generate a certain amount of humility about where we stand right now, I think. So anyway, I'm going to start by showing you some devices. I hope you can see the screen that I put up here, because this is the first of them. This is a machine called a phrasoscope. And it's an ingenious little thing. It's basically made of cardboard and with one little spring on it. And it was circulated in, I think, the hundreds of thousands in the mid-1950s, or at least versions of this were. And what it is a very simple version of a experimental psychology device called a tachistoscope. And what it does is it flashes in front of your eyes a series of characters. In this case, in the example that I put on the screen, numbers. And you can change the interval of time for which these numbers are flashed up. It could be 1/25th of a second, or 1/50th of a second, or 100th of a second, or something like that. And the idea is that it will first show how fast you can actually read characters. And then if you keep doing it, it will train you to read characters faster. And this was part of a real kind of big business endeavor in the mid-50s to train Americans to become better, faster, more efficient, less fatigued readers of characters. So the first of these machines is the phrasoscope, which is an example of a device called a tachistoscope, and I'll come back to that. The second machine is this. This is a reading accelerator, and it's similar kind of vintage, mid 1950s. And again, these were circulated in enormous quantities. It was said at one time that every single American household will have encountered one of these machines in some form. This one's a relatively robust one. It's made of metal, as you can see. And what happens with this is that you put your book underneath it. There's a kind of glass window that you can see the text through. And there's a kind of clockwork mechanism, which you can change the speed of. You can see a little dial there on the left. It's dialed to 40 at the moment, and you can change it to 35 or 50 or whatever. And depending on how fast you set it, that little opaque piece of metal glides down the screen, down the window, and it blocks off the text from your eyes. And so the idea with this is that it makes your eyes move faster, and it trains your brain to take in the text faster. So again, this is all about trying to train people to be better, more efficient readers of texts. It's a little bit terrifying, I think. If you've ever tried one of these, it's it's a bit humiliating to realize how slow, at least I am, at this. So that's the second machine. It's called an accelerator. And the third machine, which I don't have an example of more recent than this, though they are still made actually in enormous quantities, is the eye movement camera. And in some ways, this is the key machine of the three. These were invented in around 1900, 1905. And the idea of this was that you took somebody who was reading a book or on the right-hand side here, a piece of music, and you fix their heads in place, and you have a camera track by reflected light where the eyes go as they move across the page. And these devices were originally big, complex, sort of Heath Robinson style devices. The one on the left, University of Chicago, is typical of these. They existed at dozens of universities across America by the mid-1920s, and they were used extensively in experimentation on readers. But they also got scaled down in size and commercialized. So the middle one here is the prototype for a device that became known as the ophthalmoscope, ophthalmograph. And it could be carried around from place to place, taken into schools, for example. So if you had school pupils whose reading abilities you were worried about, you might put them in this eye reading camera, and it could tell you how their eyes were moving as they read books. And in a way that I'll come to in a minute, you might then be able to tell in what ways they were not good readers and in what ways they might improve. And there were then techniques to do the improving. So the science of reading in the early 20th century, before neuroscience, before fMRI imaging, essentially was a kind of composite of the use of these three kinds of instruments. And in particular, I want to say the tachistoscope, the first of them that flashes up images, and the eye movement camera that shows where the eye is moving. And starting in sort of the 1920s, and for about 50 years, this was a really big scientific endeavor. In fact, it may be, and I'm a little hesitant to say this, but I think it's possibly true. It may be the version of technological science that more Americans encountered in their personal lives than any other. Because in the 1950s, you were quite likely to come across this, firstly at school, then at university, then in your armed services, military career. They stationed devices like these on aircraft carriers, for example. Then in your corporate career, if you were a manager who worked at a company like GE or General Motors, then it was very likely you'd be put through a reading training program that used these machines. And in your private life, you might use them as well, because American households received these machines through the mail by companies like Reader's Digest. And there were any number of private companies that set up so-called reading laboratories in American cities. So there was one right next to the New York Public Library, for example, in New York. There was one in downtown Chicago. It's very likely there was one in Urbana-Champaign, though I don't know. There was certainly one in Toronto. They were in California cities as well. So you were very likely to come across this. And what I want to say, this is, if anything, the big point that I want to make is that for decades, generations, what reading was in America was shaped by these machines and by their use. Because when you think about it, even though, for us, reading is largely second nature, right? We do it unconsciously. It's interesting. It's hard to stop yourself doing it. If you walk through the street and you follow, posters or billboards or something like that, it's very hard to look at a billboard with words on it and not read them. It's become so automatic with us. But of course, reading is not a natural thing. It's not conditioned by evolution in any simple way, at least. And as far as we know, no non-human creature has ever done it. So it is something that has to be trained into us, which means that the way that we learn to do it and the skill that we then acquire is shaped by the manner of the training. And the manner of the training for a long time in the 20th century was decided by these machines and the science that used them. So that's the big thing that I want to say. And it's, I think, a kind of disconcerting point, because, what that means is that even quite recently, 50, 60 years ago, what it was to read may in some sense have been different from what it is now, because now we don't use these machines. Anyway, to go back to the beginning a bit, why have a science of reading at all? Why was it launched in the late 19th, early 20th century? I think there are two reasons for that. There's a sort of social reason and there's a scientific reason. The social reason is that the world of media and information was just exploding at that time. This is the generation when things like linotype and mass steam printing, industrial printing, are really making mass media possible, mass print media possible, in a way that they hadn't actually been before. And in that light, the ideal of an informed citizenry, which had really existed in the United States since the revolution, maybe before the revolution, takes on a new shape, a new kind of anxiety. Because you need now to have really your mass population to be literate, to be able to engage with this world of industrialized information. Partly for the reasons of democracy. The first large franchise elections are in the late 19th century. So not only in the United States, but in countries like France and the UK, it's a common concern that if you're going to have, real popular franchise democracy, then you need to have an electorate that is able to manage information for itself. And that means making them literate. But it's also a matter of industry itself, because industry at this period, big capitalism, is less sort of a matter of just single factories that have workers who are almost like cogs in a mechanism, and more in the nature of things like railroads, electricity companies. So big network concerns that are in their own right information enterprises. So they invent things like filing systems. And that means that your workers have to be able to be sort of information virtuosi. And again, you can't do that unless they're adequately taught to read. So one part of it is that. It has to do with the environment within which people live. The other part of it is that the sciences themselves had developed in such a way as to provide a means to address that kind of challenge, particularly in Germany, with the advent of an enterprise that was called psychophysics. And psychophysics was an ambitious enterprise to try to do for human nature what physics per se was doing for inanimate nature. So in laboratories that were crammed full of technical equipment, humans were put into devices that could measure things like their reaction times. How quickly could you read a character, that kind of thing. And the measurements were supposed to be precise and objective, and we're going to be providing a kind of basis of instrumental facts, out of which a new science of human nature could eventually evolve. And these kinds of machines, eye cameras in particular, and tachistoscopes, are absolutely typical of mid to late stage psychophysics. In fact, I think that the tachistoscope actually comes from Germany in this period, and it was brought back to the United States by one of a cadre of US students who went to Germany in the late 19th century and brought psychophysics back with them. And when they brought it back, the form that it took was the science of reading. So the most important of them is a figure called James McKean Cattell, who went to learn with the inventor of psychophysics, a character called Wilhelm Wundt, in Leipzig. And while he was there, invented a machine called a gravity chronometer. You can see here a couple of people doing experiments on reading using a gravity chronometer in the very late 19th century. And what this is basically like a mechanical version of that first device that I showed you. It's a machine that can kind of make characters visible to you for a fraction of a second. And it measures very precisely how fast you can react and read those characters. Cattell invented this and systematically investigated how fast people could read, not only characters, but words. And one of the things that he discovered, which became a linchpin of the science of reading, was that people read words, recognizable words, faster than they read individual characters. In other words, that the brain is recognizing something like patterns that are familiar to it, which is a not necessarily obvious conclusion, but by 1900 it was largely established, and it was established with experimental instruments like this. It's worth though saying that the readers that Cattell was looking at first at least, were not children, and they're not learners. These are quite skilled readers. So his first 4 experimental subjects were Cattell himself, John Dewey, the philosopher, Joseph Jastrow, who was one of the leading early experimental psychologists, and G. Stanley Hall, who was the first person to hold a psychology professorship in America. So, so these are not, your everyday Joe Bloggs readers. Still, what Cattell thought that he could show from this was the way that excellent readers read. And then the question was, how do you make other people into excellent readers? The other thing that he was careful to record, and this is actually very unusual for psychophysics, is not only things like average values across the different readers that he measured, but how far individuals departed from the average, above or below. Were they better or were they worse? And it's not entirely clear why he did that, because psychophysics people usually didn't. They were interested in what they thought were universal human standards. The best explanation, and this was Cattell's own explanation too, was that he was a sports coach. And he was interested, therefore, in the people who were really, really good, who was the fastest sprinter. And he applied this also to readers. So he wanted to know who was really, really good at reading. And by the same counter, who was really bad at reading. And this is important because it helps the industry, the discipline as it emerges, become a diagnostic and a remedial enterprise. So anyway, so a bunch of students come back to the United States from Germany, Cattell their leader, and in various universities, they set up these instruments. But by about 1920, there are elaborate reading labs in about 20 American universities. So Columbia is a big one where Cattell was. University of Chicago had a very famous lab. Harvard, as I say, basically every major university you can think of had them. And out of this develops a kind of systematic enterprise where you use digitoscopes and eye cameras to investigate reading and to diagnose reading problems. So here's what you do. The first thing you do is you set your reader in front of one of those eye cameras and you have them read something. And what eye cameras do is they produce on a film strip traces like this. And you have to imagine here that time is the vertical axis. So what's happening is that as you read across a page, this film strip is moving up slowly. And the thing is that when you read a line, subjectively, it feels like your eye just scans across at a constant pace, but it actually doesn't. What happens is that it hops. So in a typical line of text, it might hop 5 times across the line. And then it skips back to the beginning of the next line, rather like an old manual typewriter carriage return. And what these film strips show is how regular that hopping, pausing, and moving back process is. Now, the hops are called saccades, which is a French word that means jerks. And the stationary moments are called fixations. So here you can see E.L. Thorndike, who's one of the first major experimental psychologists at Columbia, undergoing one of these tests. And you can see that his reading is actually very regular. So it just hops regular, back, regular. That's good. That's the sign of a good reader. because it's held that regular motions like that, as with factory workers in working machines, are less fatiguing, they're less prone to error, they're more efficient, so they're signs of better reading. You have one or two people here, though, who are less regular, and those are people who might need remediation. Here are some other examples from actual school children. So the one on the left, the high school girl who makes excellent grades in all her subjects, looks a bit like Thorndike. You've got a very regular hopping from across the line and then a backtracking. She never goes back and checks anything. She knows what she's doing. The reading graph on the right-hand side, on the other hand, of a boy in 5th grade whose reading rate is 20 words per minute is a bit of a disaster. It doesn't show any of that regularity. It's kind of, it even breaks in the middle. And as the commentary says, unless remedial training is given and he's reconditioned to read properly, he will continue to be a problem case or drop out of school. So this is the problem that the science of reading with these eye cameras shows up. So so the first thing you do, you put them in the eye camera, and it shows you this kind of image. Then you give them tachistoscopes. What the tachistoscope shows is how much the reader can take in at each pause, because it was realized early on, and this again becomes an axiom of the whole science, that your eye doesn't take in anything when it's moving. So the idea is that as you do the cards, as you leap point to point down the line, you only take in words when the eye pauses, when it stops. And at that point, you have a field of view. And you have to take in that field very fast. So you can improve reading by increasing the field and accelerating the speed with which they take in the field, and making there be fewer saccades, fewer jumps. So if you put people in a tachistoscope, you can tell how much they take in per fixation, and hopefully train them to take in more. So this is what people would do. And this extended into classrooms. So here you have the ophthalmograph that developed out of that prototype that I showed, and also a metronoscope, which was a commercially produced tachistoscope that you took into schoolrooms, as you can see here in Winnetka. And it flashes up in front of your class words. And the idea is that you encourage your students to read the words at the fixation point faster by flashing up these words with a shorter and shorter interval. And this is the kind of thing that first device that I showed you, the little cardboard one, allows you to take home and do for your own family, right? But it was supposed to be done in schools as well. And the other thing is that probably I don't know how many people here have ever learned reading from the Dick and Jane books. But for generations, the Dick and Jane books were the standard ways in which Americans learned to read. Now, these books were actually produced by a University of Chicago experimental psychologist working in the science of reading lab at Chicago, a man called William Gray, with text written by an author called Zerner Sharp, who lived down in Indiana. And it was one of a whole series of these what were called readers, elementary reading textbooks. And the thing about them is that they're designed typographically and in terms of layout to accentuate the kinds of aims that the science of reading in the 1920s was telling you should look for. So this is actually not from a Dick and Jane book. This is from a book produced by a colleague of Gray's called Guy Buswell, who invented that ophthalmograph. And on the right-hand side is a page of the reader that your 5-year-old would read. Jack abed, morning came over the hill, and so on. On the left-hand side is a part of a page of a kind of little pamphlet that was tucked into the beginning of this book for the teachers. So the students never saw this. And what it shows you is how the page is laid out to encourage the eye to move in that regular fashion. So the top line here shows the movements that an eye camera records of an untrained school child, with the top numbers being the sequence of movement and the bottom numbers being the duration of the fixation. Each vertical line is a fixation. And the bottom line shows the movements of a trained University of Chicago student. So the trained student hops equally 1, 2, 3, 4 across, and then would go back. The untrained person doesn't hop regularly and actually retrogresses at certain points because they're not, they're forgetting where they are and need to recheck. And so the training program that Dick and Jane and this series, which was called The Silent Reading Hour, are supposed to pursue, supposed to follow, is how to get from that top line to the bottom line. And it's arguable, I think, that almost every American reader in the mid-20th century who grew up as an adult to be a good reading citizen became a reader through this mechanism. So this is the kind of consequence of this, right? However, at the same time, there's also another branch of the science of reading, which doesn't look like this at all. This is a social science, and it happens at the same time in the 1920s. And like the kind of psychophysics style of the science of reading, it's actually based primarily in Chicago. And it's originated when one of the practitioners of the science of reading with the eye cameras and so forth is recruited by the president of the University of Chicago to head up a new library science initiative, Graduate School of Library Science, in the late 20s. And this man, Douglas Waples, inaugurates it during the Roosevelt administration, a whole social science endeavor extending across the country to measure how social groups of readers actually operate. What are they reading? When are they reading it? How frequently are they reading it? What are they doing with it when they read it? And this is not a laboratory science. This is a social science that involves sending researchers out into the field. And the result of this is a series of books that are designed to try to produce social policies to enhance America as an information society. And the most remarkable of them is a book of which this is one page, called The Geography of Reading, written by a man called Lewis Wilson in the mid-30s. And what the Geography of Reading does is it takes a number of indices, proxies, if you will, for the information society. So newspaper subscriptions, Reader's Digest subscriptions, library provision, and it maps them on the same scale across the United States in 150 maps that look like this. So this may be library provision, for example. And the point of it is that as you look through this book as a reader, you more or less develop a kind of mental afterimage of what all these maps look like when they're put one on top of another. And what they look like is essentially this. It's that the density of information access in the United States in the mid-1930s is entirely in the Northwest, Northeast, and to a lesser extent in the Midwest, in Ohio, in Chicago, and places like that. On the other hand, the Cotton Belt is, as Wilson says, a tragedy. It's a total information desert. And that's repeated across every domain, book ownership, book borrowing, newspapers, radio listening, everything you can think of. And so the impetus of, so whereas the impetus of the lab science of reading was to improve individual readers by deploying these instruments, the effect of this social science of reading is to call for dramatic policy changes in Washington, D.C., in the federal government, to create what Wilson and his followers called equalization. The idea was that there had to be substantial investment to level up, as it were, the Cotton Belt in library provision, in newspapers, and schools, above all by, in some way, supervening segregation. That's the big issue, right? And of course, this equalization motif was taken up by civil rights campaigners in things like library sit-ins in the post-war era, and became a major theme of the Brown versus Board of Education campaign in the 50s. So these two kinds of science of reading, by the mid to late 30s, have shown some disquieting facts about America. The first is that it's a massively unequal society in terms of information. And this is the first time that that's been actually systematically measured. The second is that many people, while they may be able to read in a technical sense, they can parse characters, are not actually readers very much, right? They're not reading habitually in everyday ways. They're not skilled, discerning, critical, practical readers. So there are calls for action. There are two things you can really do. Three things, maybe. One of them is the social policy that I've just mentioned. One is that you can have a massive program of adult education to remediate these people who can technically read but don't do it very much. And in cities like New York and Chicago, this happens. So groups like the Rosenwald Foundation, Carnegie, so forth, create big public education efforts. And the University of Chicago scientists go out and use film strips in an effort to train people's eyes to make them into better readers. But the other thing you can do is if you can't improve readers, and that was going to be a mammoth task, especially in the Deep South, the other thing you can do is make books less hard. And so at Columbia University in particular, an extension of the science of reading is formed called the science of readability. And this is centered on a lab, of course, the readability lab run by Thorndike, which creates indices, standards of readability that are going to be applied to the publishing industry in New York and are going to tell that industry how to produce books, not for the ideal readers that they think exist, but for the actual readers whom Wilson and others have shown to exist. These books are going to be radically simplified. They're going to use very simple vocabularies, and they are made. So classic literature, for example, is reprinted in a large scale in simplified form, and the changes are not trivial. So, for example, if you pick up a standard, the real version of Moby Dick, it's what, 800-900 pages? I'm not sure. But the simplified version of Moby Dick that was produced for readability purposes is about 150 pages. So, make of that what you will, if you like. But so the Readability Lab produced a series of graduates who then go on to run libraries in the Deep South, especially, where their business, as they see it, is to attune the library stocks to the audiences that actually exist in the South. And thereby to build up readerships over generations and to create a kind of information democracy. But another graduate, maybe the most famous graduate of all, is a Viennese emigre called Rudolf Flesch, who produces a standard of readability, a quantitative measure of readability, that's really the most widely used of all of the standards. But Flesch then becomes famous by producing a book in the 50s called Why Johnny Can't Read, which is a swinging attack on the whole science of reading and this educational culture that it produced, and really the foundation of today's phonics reading wars. Anyway, so this is what the science of reading looked like in the mid-century, and I want to talk now about how it pervaded the society and how it gave rise to some of the things that we think of as elements of our information society. So in the first place, starting in the late 30s and running through the 50s and 60s, a big business grew up of accelerated reading. And I've mentioned this at the beginning, using those kinds of tools, those instruments. The person more than anybody else who's responsible for this is a slightly eccentric experimental psychologist at Ohio State University called Samuel Renshaw. This is Renshaw using a tachistoscope as a kind of slide projector. And Renshaw picked up on this use of tachistoscopes to improve readers. And he thought that you could improve readers to be almost superhuman. That you could have them reading, thousands of words a minute if you train them sufficiently. And the way you trained them was to recognize patterns, long patterns of characters in one flash. And if you did this, then they could become superpowered readers. And he thought this was just one step in a whole program of revolutionizing everybody's sensory capacities in general. So not just perception, but sight and hearing and taste and touch. All of these things he thought could be radically elevated using similar kinds of technologies. And in World War II, Renshaw capitalized on this by selling to the US military a program for the fast identification of aircraft. The idea was that if you're in a US ship or a plane, and an enemy plane or a friendly plane is coming towards you, you only have a split second to realize what that plane is. And so what Renshaw did was he used tachistoscopes to get servicemen to, as it were, read the identity of planes as patterns. And he trained, or his proxies trained, something like 300,000 American service personnel in World War II, such that by the mid-40s, every single American military ship had Renshaw personnel on it. And aircraft carriers were actually carrying tachistoscopes on them to train their own crew. And this spread beyond the United States. It was the British RAF trained people with this as well. And in the wake of World War II, this remarkable success, as it was seen, was then parlayed into business success as Renshaw and his followers, especially his prize student, who was called William Schwarzbeck. I think this is Schwarzbeck here, training an employee at GE, created businesses to revolutionize, as they saw it, American industry by making managers sort of 10 times as fast in reading. I mean, it's as though if somebody were to come to you today and say, you can get all of the email that you need to do in 1 week done on Monday morning, right? Then you could spend the rest of the week doing useful stuff. This is very much the sales line that these people have in the 50s. And Schwarzbeck in particular became one of America's leading experimental industrial psychologists while working at GE for a couple of decades. And he invoked these machines up and down the American corporate landscape. So this is a Renshaw tachistoscopic trainer sold to companies for training managers, this kind of thing. So as you can see, it's reduced in scale. This is something you can carry around and actually train your managers with. This is the kind of warning that persuaded companies like GE to take up this task. So reading inefficiently is as bad as wasting resources, that kind of thing, that kind of line. This is a management reading program that came in a little case. That, you know, if you're some standard American corporation, you can help your managers become better readers by training them with this kind of tachistoscopic technique. The little instrument you can see on the right inside that case is a bad little plastic tachistoscope. And these people, they used eye cameras as well and reading accelerators. There's a whole, the standard triumvirate of instruments. And this was very, very widely distributed. So the CIA had one in its headquarters. The US Air Force had one in its headquarters. There was one in the Pentagon. John F. Kennedy was said to have been trained using this kind of technique. Jimmy Carter introduced it to the White House. So it went on for a long time. And it had great hopes attached to it. And reading labs were big kind of commercial successes in the 1950s, 60s. One of the ways in which this kind of thing transits into the way that we deal with information now actually has to do with that use of the science of reading for aircraft, for aerospace. And it's a little bit different. So one of the problems that the American Air Forces had in World War II was that planes used to crash on landing for no obvious reason, and not because of enemy action. The US military lost something like 1,000 planes in World War II within the US land space. So these were not planes that were shot down. There was something weird going on where as planes came into land, pilots would suddenly become disoriented and crash. And the American military decided this was a problem of psychology. So they hired a man called Paul Fitts to look into it. Fitts was eventually at Ohio State alongside Renshaw and so forth. And what Fitts did was he interviewed a few pilots and realized this problem of disorientation existed and decided that it was a problem in the reading of instruments. So it's a science of reading kind of problem. So what he does is he deploys the science of reading for it. And the first thing he does is to use eye cameras. So he places an eye camera in the cockpit of a plane. You can see it here. It's this machine that's in the foreground of the picture. And he has pilots practice landing using instruments. And what the camera shows is where on the instrument panel the pilot's eyes go. And they reveal that at crucial moments, the pilot's eyes are flicking to the wrong instrument. And the reason for that is that aircraft cockpits at this point were not standardized. So if you flew a B-17, say, then the altimeter might be where the speedometer or something was in a B-25. And actually, it's even worse than that because the controls were also mixed up. So people, if you're used to a B-17, you might think you were putting the flaps down and you were actually lowering the undercarriage on a B-25, something like that. So the first thing he says is you have to standardize cockpit designs. But then he brings the pilots down to the ground and shows them tachistoscopic images of dials from the instruments. And these may look very similar, but if we think about things like the type size, what he's interested in is how much information can you take in, how quickly, when your eye glances at that instrument at the critical moment when you're coming into land. And so it's very like the Renshaw thing. And what he ends up with is a standard way in which cockpit dials should be designed. And I'm not a pilot, so I can't say this at first hand, but my understanding is that the standardization of cockpits to this day is actually inherited from what Fitz designed at the wake of World War II. But the other thing that he did was that by this point we're into the late 40s, which is the beginnings of the science of information, with communications science, people like Shannon and Weaver coming up with formulas for information transfer. And what Fitz does is he realizes that this is a problem like theirs, and that you can express it in a mathematical formula, which he does. It comes to be called Fitz law. And it's a law relating the accuracy with which your eyes or hands can move across a space and hit a target so that you can take in information at that target. And in the 1960s, this Fitz law becomes a central part of what was called human-computer interaction, which was the discipline devoted to exactly that, to understanding about how humans and computers interact with each other. And in the late 60s and 70s in particular, as forms of graphic interfaces were starting to be designed, it's that decides what way we have of interacting with the computers that we use. So in particular, a mouse, rather than something like a joystick, is what was called a Fitz law device. That is, it's a device that allows us to get arbitrarily close to the Fitz law ideal of moving across a space and hitting that target with maximum speed and informational accuracy. So one of the major ways in which we interact with computers is actually a direct descendant of this application of the science of reading in the mid-20th century. Another similar kind of thing. So back when the science of reading was being used to train readers, Thorndike and others at Columbia had a thought experiment that they could invent a book that would only allow you to proceed to the next page once it had registered that you'd read the previous page correctly. And a version of this was actually made by one of Redshaw's colleagues at Ohio State called Sidney Pressey in the 1920s, but it was completely forgotten until about 1960, when the champion of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, reinvented it and started championing an enterprise that he called programmed learning, which would be done by what he designed as teaching machines, which you can see one here on the left. Now, in Skinner's eyes, teaching machines would be completely behaviorist. They would treat children as if they were lab rats, and children would be rewarded for reading things right, and they couldn't proceed until they got that reward. But there were other ways of using computers to teach reading, and of using the teaching of reading to interact with computers, which were much more to do with cognitive science and the rebellion against behaviorism that happened in that era. And the right-hand side image here with the child staring at a computer sort of printer is an example of that. This is a device called the talking typewriter that was invented in the early 60s and was actually put into use in some American schools to teach children to read, and not only to read, but to become actual readers in that much more creative way. And the idea is that this was what was called an autotelic environment. That is, it's an environment where the children decide their own route through it. So it's not behaviorist. It's not that they're getting stimulus and response. It's that they kind of design their own, journalism actually was what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to create newspapers. And this idea of the way in which humans and computers interact in a kind of open but also algorithmic way was absolutely critical, not only to how children were thought to learn to read in this era and how thinking in general was thought to work in this era under cognitive science, but also for the first generation of artificial intelligence. Because if you look at the first AI pioneers in the mid-60s, very often what they're trying to do is to teach computers to learn to read, to parse characters, and to become fluent readers, sometimes even translators, actually, out of other languages into English. And it's an interesting moment because you find that the AI pioneers are trying to encode into computers what they think children do, while the teachers of children are trying to get children to do what they think computers do. And so there's this kind of strange bootstrapping process that happens in early AI for about 10 years. And one of the directions that goes is towards this, which is produced by one of the more visionary computer pioneers of this period, a man called Alan Kay, who'd been inspired by lectures on the latest ways of teaching children to read and the latest cognitive science, and this kind of world of the talking typewriter, to envisage a kind of portable version of the talking typewriter, which he calls the Dynabook, which, as he describes it, is a toy for children of all ages. And the purpose of this was to facilitate the learning of reading by children, or for that matter, adults as well. So it's a device that's supposed to bring text to you in a dynamic and interactive way. And it's now regarded as the first ever laptop. This is the design for it, which Kay actually took on the road and marketed to people like English teachers with a speech that explicitly invoked the speed reading campaigns. Kay actually claimed that he himself could read something like 1,000 words a minute, which is typical for the statistics that the reading accelerators claimed. So in these kinds of ways, there isn't a hard and fast divide between the mid-20th century science of reading and the way in which computers and the digital world has evolved. On the contrary, the way in which we interact with that world is actually deeply indebted to that earlier science. So a few things to say in conclusion about all this. Maybe I'll just keep that up. The first is, we live in a world of reading wars. Anybody who's a parent will have encountered these. And I started with this thought that it's now being mandated that elementary school teaching be done by phonics. And the claim is that the alternative, what's called balanced literacy, where children are taught to read by patterns rather than individual characters, and they're not, especially that they're not told to sound out characters. That's the real difference. That's based on a kind of superstition. And the science of reading tells us that it's false. But of course, there's a deep irony to that, as I began with, because that earlier notion was based on a different rigorous science. And the fact is that the neuroscience that now underpins phonics, once you get beyond elementary reading, it tells you different things. For example, it becomes clear that we are all subject to what's called neuroplasticity, which is that the pathways in the brain that we form through habits are not hardwired in us and are changed as culture changes. And they're not inherited by our children. This is not Lamarckianism or something. What that means is that what might be thought of as a very reductionist science based on neuroimaging actually tells us that you need to understand culture in order to understand what good reading is, because neuroplasticity means that we attune to the culture as we learn to be good readers. So the reading wars are only going to get us so far. They're not going to, we need to be mindful of that as well as the elementary stuff. Secondly, I think one wants to, we should be thinking more than we are, not only about the science of reading, but about the reading of science, and in particular about reading in science. Because, as you may have heard, there's all kinds of worries at the moment about fraud and irreproducibility in published scientific papers. Now, it used to be thought that science was the perfect self-policing enterprise. This goes back to an idea of Rob Merton, the sociologist in the 1950s, because of things like peer review. But what's happening with peer review, the reading of scientific papers by peers, if countless numbers of papers are going through that contain nonsense? And it's actually interesting. There have been surveys that show that the irreproducible papers, once they're out, tend to be read more than the papers that are actually reproducible because their claims are more interesting. So there's something very strange going on about the disciplinary skill of reading among highly technical scientific readers. And I think that same point could be extended across the disciplines as well. So, historians, English lit people, and so forth. We often just don't know what it is to read in those kinds of disciplines. And I think the empirical project needs to be launched to actually investigate that. Thirdly, if you talk about training readers, and a lot of this is about training, if you talk about that today, a lot of people will think you mean not humans, but machines, because a lot of the concern is about how we train machine readers, AIs, bots, things like that. In fact, one of my colleagues has just published a paper where he purposefully set out to train mischievous AI readers to do things that are not predictable, that are going to be crazy but interesting. And there's a lot of anxiety as well as promise to that. But again, we're not well placed to understand yet what it is. In a certain sense, we need to go back to that world of the strange feedback bootstrapping, where teachers of human readers and teachers of AIs were talking to each other back in the 60s. Finally, I find these machines really fascinating. And I've struggled a bit to kind of articulate to myself quite why I find them so fascinating. And I think it's this. Usually, as Kate said at the beginning, I'm an early modernist. I usually deal with the 16th and 17th century. So I'm really out of my terrain with this stuff. And I found myself thinking, supposing I were in a library, like the special collections in a library, and I found a design for one of these machines done by somebody in the 17th century. I'd be absolutely excited out of my wits by that, because I would think, right, that's my career. This is it, And the reason is that a machine like that in the 17th century would firstly hint at just how foreign that culture is to us. If people read in this way, then they're really strange. But it would also bridge that gap. It would tell us how to understand that strangeness. And I feel that in looking at these machines in the 1950s, I've been looking at them as though they were built in the 1650s. So I feel that they show that the 1950s are much weirder than we think they were. But at the same time, they provide a way to understand that weirdness and to get over what might otherwise seem a merely solipsistic kind of sense that everything was alien and we just can't understand it. I think we can understand it when we understand it through reconstructing what it was to use these machines. But the thing is that once we're dealing with the 50s and 60s and 70s, we're getting awfully close to us. I remember from when I was an elementary school child in Britain, not so much the machines, but some of the books that came out of these machines were in my classroom when I was learning to read. So a question that I always think is fruitful when I approach the 17th century is, what on earth did they think they were doing? And I think it's also fruitful to apply that to the 1950s and 60s. But the thing about that is that it shades into, what on earth do we think we're doing? Because as historians, of course, we read things all the time. That's the way in which we claim to understand something about the past. And at some level, we just assume that our reading is commensurable, at least, with what people did in a coffee house in London in 1680 or something. I think we need to be a little bit more hesitant about that and humble about it. And it gives me the sense of feeling like I'm Wile E. Coyote or something who's just run off a cliff and suddenly realized that there isn't any ground under him. The problem that we get then, and I think it's a not only a problem but a fantastically exciting opportunity, is to try to figure out how to return to some kind of ground once it's been cut away from us by this sort of realization of just how strange things can be. So with that, I'll stop, and I hope that's interesting. And I'm as Kate said, I'm very happy to entertain questions if people have any.
All right, thank you so much, Adrian. That was fascinating. My brain is just going a million miles a minute, honestly. Uh, and for those of you who are locals, I mentioned earlier, his book is available at the Illinois Union Bookstore. For those of you who are non-local, it is available wherever books are sold. It is a truly fantastic read. If you have any questions, please do put them in Q&A or in the chat. Looks like we've got one. Oh, Anne Blair, many thanks, Adrian. Did they test for mental retention of reading rather than just speed?
Hi, Anne. It's nice to hear from you. Thanks for taking part of this. Yeah, I mean, they sort of did, and in fact, one of the reasons why this whole speed reading enterprise doesn't exactly collapse, but it loses its promise in the 60s, I want to say, is that it seems to fail at that. It does seem, if you I mean, this is controversial now to say this, but if you look at the experimental findings at that time, it does seem that people did accelerate their reading. They did get faster. I mean, not to the fantastic extent that some of these people claimed, but they got better. The problem is that it's not so clear that they retain stuff very well. And also the sheer skill of being able to read fast erodes. So once you stop doing the tachistoscope experiments and trials and so forth, once you go back to your everyday life, in about 3 months, your reading is back to what it was before. That seems to be what happens. So it doesn't take in a lasting sense. But yeah, they were worried about retention. The other thing they're worried about, of course, which is related to this, is comprehension. And the whole idea that comprehension is something you can test really comes out of an anxiety that just being able to pass characters and being able to do things really fast is not the key thing. And so people start articulating, well, what is the key thing? Well, the key thing may be comprehension, some kind of understanding. Can you quantify that? And so there develops a whole industry of comprehension tests, and which certainly I had to go through at school. And I don't know whether other people have had this experience, but I remember it was a weird thing, because if you were quite good at reading and you were being given a test that was meant for people who are not terribly good at reading, then you had to kind of second guess what the examiner thought that a mediocre reader would comprehend in a certain text, which would not be something like deep structural symbolism or something. It would be some very literal thing. So you kind of had to work down to the text to those things. But yeah, no, they were very, very worried about those kinds of things.
All right, thank you. Sandy Malcolm asks, did any of the technology you've described offer insights into dyslexia, or were they too early for that to be recognized?
Yeah, no, this was a big thing. So dyslexia, it was typically called back in the early 20th century congenital word blindness. And it's a big problem for these people, because their idea is that you can have a science of this. But if you find that there are like substantial numbers of people who just are not on the charts even, that calls into question the very possibility of having a science of it. It's as though like planets generally move, in ellipses according to Kepler's laws, but here's one that goes completely off the rails. It's, it would call into question the very existence of celestial mechanics. It's like that. And what happens is that it becomes visible as an actual sort of a social fact, as it were, in the late 20s, early 30s. And it's directly because of the application of these people's skills. So there are two key people. There's a woman called Clara Schmidt, who graduates out of the Chicago school and goes to work for Chicago Public Schools, where she's assigned to teach remedial reading to students who are bright, they're perfectly intelligent, but just don't seem to pick up reading. And then another graduate called Marion Monroe goes off to Iowa, where she becomes part of a program run by a man called Orton, which is taking a mobile clinic around Iowa schools, and again trying to teach people who are not good at reading but otherwise intelligent. And what these things show is that this problem of congenital word blindness is not just a matter of individuals. It exists at a certain statistical level across the school districts, which means that it's something that you can render scientific. And in fact, Orton and Monroe and Schmidt come up with ways of adapting these kinds of tools to identify what gets known as dyslexia. And it's a long story after that, but the identification of dyslexia as an actual thing, rather than just individual people who are not very good at reading, is as a direct product of this application of this. Yeah.
Thank you. Megan Genovese asks, how much of, quote, getting better at reading during these tests is just a matter of practicing more and more regularly?
Who knows? It may well be, except that, and I think that if you go and you're stuck in one of these machines, not even, certainly with the huge ones that exist in the labs where you really have to kind of hold your head still and you've got this massive tube in front of you. But even with the relatively small ones like the ophthalmograph, you're put into an artificial situation. And the kind of reading that you do is of snippets, right? They typically don't give you like all of Moby Dick to read. Though actually some experiments do actually have you read for hours at a time. That was done occasionally. But usually you're given like a paragraph. And so you're in this highly kind of contained, constrained situation. Even more with tachistoscopes where things are flashing up in front of you. And usually those are number sequences rather than words, unless they're specifically measuring something about words. The idea being that they want to measure like the extent of your visual field, and they don't want you recognizing a pattern for that. Right. So for those things, it seems to me that it's probably not just a matter of practice, because what you're doing is sufficiently different from everyday reading that that you're kind of practicing something that's a skill in its own right, I think. So it may be, but I think as far as I know, nobody ever did a kind of side-by-side experiment with a control group where they had one control group just practice reading every night and the other control group do tachistoscopes. As far as I know, nobody did that.
Thank you. Dana Hahn thanks you for your talk and asks if the experiments back then, whether they counted the gender differences in addition to the age differences.
Yeah, they did. They were interested in this, and they were interested in race as well. In fact, I think I want to say they're more interested in race than they are in gender, actually. I think they tend to think that men and women are more or less equal. I mean, it's interesting that in the photographs of the machines, very often the readers in the machines are women. And I don't know the names of the particular women. Like in the first one that I showed, I think is a woman, but I don't know who those are. But it is quite frequently the case that these are women readers that they're testing. And we do know names, we know the names of their groups. We can't put the names of the particular people in front of the machines in the photographs. And they tend to find, I think, that there isn't much difference between men and women, but I think they tend to assume that. With race, it's much more complicated because, they do this in Chicago, which is right in the middle of the Great Migration. So they find, differences between black and white, but usually their reasoning about that has to do with education systems in the Deep South. Rather than innate differences, and so they'll find that African Americans who've lived in Chicago for a while get better than people who've just been taught in these Deep South, really what passes for the education system in the Deep South at this point. So yeah, they are attuned to these kinds of differences, and I think that if there's a historian who wants to go out there and investigate this, they'll find a lot actually. I kind of skated over it a bit because I was, in pursuit of different quarry, but there's certainly a lot there I think that could be researched.
Awesome. John Ramos thanks you for the wonderful lecture and asks a question about the history of you trace interactions with religious instruction, namely how children and others were taught to read the Bible as Catholics, Protestants, Jewish, etc. Whether this showed up at all in demographic studies that you discussed, were there any generalizations hazarded about their abilities to read secular texts? What about reading comprehension in private religious schools? And thanks you for your answers.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. That's an absolutely fascinating question. I haven't seen it empirically in the work that I've been tracing. It must exist though. I mean, because it's such one of the cultural rifts, one of the ways in which you sort culture in this country is to do with religious upbringing. So it must exist. There was certainly interest, I mean, this is a little bit different, but there was certainly interest in readers of things like Hebrew, where the character sets are different and the direction of reading is different. That's a little bit different, though. They're not interested in something like religiosity per se. They're much more interested in the kind of, psychophysics of it. Yeah, I want to say it has to. I think where it's going to exist is actually in the Waples library science kind of work. I think that's where they would have been sorting populations, maybe according to religious affiliation or something like that. But I'll have to go back and look. Thank you. It's something that I don't know the answer to, but I feel that there must be something really interesting to say about it.
Warren Levy asks, does the science of reading include critical analysis during the time the reader spends with the text, or does it aim at analysis by the reader after and separated from recognizing all the words written by the author?
Yeah, it's really the latter, at least in these early stages. I think by the time you get to cognitive science work, which is really late 60s and onwards, then there's more emphasis on creativity. So there are cognitive science views of what reading is, which basically take reading to be a kind of experimental activity. So the idea is that what's happening at incredibly high speed is that as your eyes move across the line, your brain is making hypotheses about what the next phrases are going to be. And if your eyes, show you that those hypotheses are correct, then you speed ahead. If your eyes show you that what's on the page diverges from the hypothesis, then you make another hypothesis. And so according to this, it's a constant cycling, almost in a kind of cybernetic way, between hypothesis and confirmation or disconfirmation by visuality. That's very different from the view that these early 20th century people had, where it's much more mechanical than that. And the fact that it's hypothesis-centered means that there is irreducibly a part of this that is creative. So one of the ways you become a better reader in this model is that you become better at forming hypotheses, which is like completely different from anything like these earlier people were doing. But it becomes central to the teaching of reading in the 60s, which is that moment of educational reform that's associated with things like the new math. It's a similar kind of mentality. And for good and ill, right? I mean, a lot of people think this is a catastrophe, but it gives rise to a new orthodoxy about how reading should be taught that has to do with training something like hypothesis formation as well as just character passing. So for that, yes, there is that sense. But earlier than this, the kind of people that I was dealing with, it's much more just that you take stuff in and it impacts you, and then you think with it afterwards.
My colleague Caroline Silowich, who is a fellow curator at the RBML, she submits a memory rather than a question. She says, a long time ago, a professor of book history commented on attributes of good book design, whether manuscript or print, and noted that well-designed books limited the width of text columns to what the human eye could parse without strain and without moving the head, which is a fairly standard measurement of a few inches. And you can kind of see that looking at some scrolls, for instance, like we seem to, as humans, fairly early on figured out what we could see fairly easily. I don't know if you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, no, these people were very attuned to this question: how wide should a column of text be? And they reached the conclusion that there was an ideal, and the ideal is basically what you see in newspapers circa 1920, because it's that whatever it is, about 3-4 inches wide. That's as far as you can go in kind of one jump. That's the idea. And so that there is a it doesn't really come to very much, but there is an idea that you should reset books to look like newspaper columns, which actually is interesting. I mean, if you're familiar with early modern books, a lot of early modern books actually do look like that, right? You have 2 or 3 columns of text in them, and they're actually totally forbidding. You try and read these, like polyglot Bibles or something. But yeah, no, the idea is that the ideal, and it's actually what they'll tend to say is that the reason why newspapers hit that ideal is that a kind of social evolution happens with newspapers in a much more ruthless way than it does with book publishing, because the newspaper trade is fast moving, right? Every day there's an iteration of it. So adaptation and competition are going to be much more pressured in the newspaper world. So their idea is that newspapers have sort of evolved in a kind of Darwinian way towards the ideal fit for human readers. So yeah, there was this kind of idea, yeah.
Isabel Ryan thanks you for the great lecture and asks, what are you most looking forward for? What are you most looking forward for in the study of the science of reading to come?
Oh wow. So my sense of I mean, if you mean what do I think is going to happen in the actual science of reading, as opposed to the history of it or something like that, I think it's really in its infancy, and I think what's interesting is that it's gone through a kind of determinist phase, as a lot of neuroscience did. Originally there was this idea that we were going to find neurons for this or that or the other, in the same way that in genetics for a while there was this ambition that we would find the gene for this, that, and the other. And in fact, of course, it turns out it's much more complicated than that. It has to do with gene expression and gene environment interaction, things like that. The same thing is true for neuroscience, that with a focus on things like neuroplasticity, we're approaching, I think, a new term of understanding between something like humanistic and social scientific inquiry on the one hand, and what might have been a reductionistic sort of neuroscientific approach on the other, because it's become clear that in some sense each side was going to need the other. The social science of reading tells us that we need to know something about the neuroscience of it. But the neuroscience of reading tells us that neuroscience alone is not enough. So I think the interesting thing is going to be what could, in principle, be a kind of grand reshaping of the disciplines in the next generation around something like this. That, I think.
Chef Rogers asks, I recently stumbled across a 1930s ad about US literacy fears. Have you found any period when there was not a crisis of literacy?
Since about 1920, no. I think there's a kind of constant, always like being rejigged crisis of literacy. But I think before about 1920, it's a bit different. I think before 1920 or so, and especially in the 19th century, it's more that there's a sense that the US population should be made more literate than it is, but that's a mission still in the making, right? By about 1920, especially it's very specific to post World War I. The sense is that yes, we have mass, essentially universal public education, and yet we have this large proportion of the American population, 30% or so, it said, that can't read effectively. That's the crisis. So you only have a crisis once you have universal education. And it's actually revealed, and this is kind of well known actually, by psychology tests, intelligence tests that were applied to the US Army recruits in World War I in an attempt to try to demarcate who would be officers and who would be men. And that was when they found out that a large proportion of the recruits couldn't actually take the intelligence test because they weren't literate enough. And that in the early 20s, when this is published, becomes a kind of public scandal, and people, I can't remember I'm blanking on the name of the famous writer who makes it into a public scandal, but it does, and that's really when the idea that there's a crisis of literacy takes root. But ever since then, I think every decade has had its crisis of literacy. Certainly 30s, certainly 50s, certainly 60s, 70s, and 2000s. Right now, this is hence No Child Left Behind. That was largely about a crisis of literacy. So yeah, I think it's since about 1920, it's stuck with us.
Joe Luttrell asks, if parents are seeking how their child could best learn to read today, how would you recommend that be done?
Okay, I don't want to fight the reading warriors. The standard line now is that neuroscience tells us that phonics is the way to teach the beginning skill of reading. In other words, you sound out the sounds of characters and link them together to make words. Cat spells cat. I am not disposed to quarrel with that. I think that, to me, that makes sense. It's how I was taught to read. I actually remember doing this in elementary school in Britain. And I think there's enough powerful evidence that doing it the other way, where you try and teach people patterns from the word go, is not good. It's not the way to do it. So I think as a parent, I would do myself, and what I would want my child's teachers to do at the very first level is phonics. The question, though, then is what you do after that, right? Once you get children to the point where they are basically functional readers, how do you make them readers in the richer sense? People who relish reading, who are flexible, critical, and all of that. That's when you need something that's much more diversified, variegated, and much more attuned to the exploratory potential of children themselves. I think this is where all the cognitive science stuff, I think, is not to be discarded. That's just my sense of it anyway. So I would want my elementary school teachers to teach phonics, but I would want my middle school teachers definitely not to teach phonics. I'd want them to be doing something else. Right, that's my sense of it. But I don't want to fight these wars, honestly.
Yeah. Don't blame you. Jeff Peachy asks, are any of the machines you mentioned operational? Thanks for the wonderful reminder of how machines shape us.
Well, thank you. I haven't found any of those big eye camera devices from the 1920s. I wish I could. I wouldn't be surprised if there's one sitting around somewhere in some attic, but I haven't found one. The ophthalmographs, metronoscopes, similarly, I haven't found actual surviving examples, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if they exist. They were produced in large quantities, so it's not impossible. I found the odd thing. So there's a psychology museum at Akron, Ohio, for example, and I found there the shell of what I think is the tachistoscopic projector that one of Renshaw's colleagues was using to teach art students. So you can find occasionally things like that. And by the 50s, when they're mass produced in these kind of simple reading accelerator devices, you can buy those on eBay, which is where I got these ones from. But no, I would really love to find one of the early ones, but I haven't yet. If anybody knows one, tell me. I'll pay good money for one. No.
Somewhere on eBay, somewhere.
Somewhere on eBay. Yeah, it must be there somewhere.
Leslie Howsam says, fabulous lecture. The field of book history is being shaken up lately. Critical bibliography, etc. Are you proposing a new approach to the methodology for the history of reading?
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for tuning into this. Yes, actually, is the answer to that. I kind of in the introduction and the conclusion of the book, I gesture at this a bit in a way that I think is a little sort of risky, and it gives hostages to fortune. But I do think that the history of reading as it's done is overly cautious and not as ambitious in kind of epistemic terms as it should be and as it could be. I think that, if the way that we read even in the 1950s, which is relatively recent, was as strange as is implied by these machines, to me at least, how strange is it going to be if you go back to the 1850s or 1750s or 1350s? And I think that not only historians of reading, but historians to core, all of them, need to be much more worried about the complacency with which we assume not so much identity of reading, but a kind of commensurability of reading across cultures. I think we need to be questioning of that more than we have been. The trouble is, in what way is that not simply a kind of counsel of despair or a counsel of perfection? Because ultimately, maybe what one's talking about is recovering subjectivity, and recovering subjectivity is basically impossible. It's not in the end, I think, what historical knowledge is for. So the part, it's like the same kind of problem. Trying to reconstruct what it was like to read in 1650 applies for something like the history of experimental practice. What was it like to do an experiment in 1650? Or political practice, what was the experience of listening to a speech in Parliament? The subjectivity part of that is ultimately irrecoverable, and it's a solipsistic piece of advice to say that we should try to recover it. The question is, what if we're aware of the difference? What does that lead us to that's actually concrete and consequential? And I think that in some cases it can lead us to concrete and consequential things, which historians of reading are doing already. But we can, I think, get further by sort of going through the pathway of asking ourselves, how did they learn the skill of reading? What was this skill? It's not what we think it was. It's something different, and not sort of reverting to human nature as an eternal, as a kind of baseline for it. So the object in the end is not just to get a kind of infinitely precise reconstruction of subjectivity. It's to use a sense of the difference of subjectivity to arrive at some story about how culture changes or doesn't change, why it changes or doesn't change. Sorry, that's rather woolly, but the short answer is yes, I do think that there's scope to actually go further than historians of reading have gone so far.
Fascinating. So I'm looking forward to your next book. No pressure. Alice Schreier writes, what are your thoughts on current research which suggests that screen reading is causing faster reading from scrolling and skimming? A recent book advocated slow reading for insight and reflection.
Yeah. And there was some research published about Christmas time that made the mass media, saying that children who were reading print, like paper print, learned more and retained more than children who read on screens. That seems intuitively true to me, but then I'm old. I mean, I was brought up on paper, so I find screens alien. But I suspect what's going on. I think people like oh God, I can't remember her name, the Proust and the Squid author. So I'm sure most of the people tuning into this will be aware of this writer. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name. The people who write about that kind of issue, they they'll tend to stress. I mean, there is a kind of Jeremiad literature, right? The shallows. There's a Jeremiad literature that the internet is dumbing us all down. I think that's not so interesting and not so plausible, actually. I think what's more plausible is that the various different ways in which we encounter text and the different expectations and affordances are multiplying the ways in which we read. And to be sure, some of them are very superficial. Scanning. I almost the first thing I do in the morning every morning is I spend about half an hour speed reading, online newspapers and that kind of thing, which is something I never used to do. And I'm not taking very much of it in, but I'm kind of scanning to look for things that I might take in. And that's a practice that, it would have been impossible actually 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I think that what's happening then is a kind of a multiplying effect. There's and a variegating effect. So if we ever thought that reading was one thing, it's becoming more and more apparent that it's not. I mean, except maybe in the very basic sense of passing characters, but in the more consequential ways of what it actually involves and what we do and what the consequences of it are, it's many things. And we need to understand that in a way that's not in the first instance normative and judgmental, in order to understand the fruitfulness actually of some of these ways of, for example, reading lots of things fast rather than small numbers of things slow. But the thing is to create citizens who hopefully will be masters of all of these techniques.
Thank you. And Caroline shares Jonah Lehrer was the author of Proust and the Squid.
No, so the person I'm thinking of is she's female. It's Marilyn something, I think. It's terrible that I can't remember. This is a very well-known person, but I'll look it up. It doesn't. I'm sure you can look it up anyway. But yeah, but there's a number of writers who've written books along this kind of line.
So we're at the end of time. I have a question I'd very much like to ask. And one of the things when I was reading your book that struck me, and I've seen similar statements in other books, but you talk about the experience of actually writing this book during the start of COVID and in lockdown. And because of the speed or rather lack thereof in academic publishing as well as publishing general, like we're starting to see more comments of that where people are talking about the genesis of projects in COVID or how they came across stumbling blocks because of everything. And I was visiting a friend of mine a few weeks ago, and we were talking about how COVID, that experience actually changed how we read. Both of us used to really read lots of novels, and both of us really struggle with that now. We read poetry and nonfiction instead. And so I'm wondering, have you seen any conversations? Do you have any thoughts about about any work that might be done on how COVID, the pandemic, etc., might have changed that? Lisa Hinchliffy comments, Marianne Wolf wrote Proust and the Squid, the story and science of the reading brain. So
thank you. Yes, Marianne Wolf. Yes, that's right. That's sorry, I should have remembered that. It was just went out of my head. Yeah, no, the COVID question is interesting. It's certainly changed intellectual life, right? Broadly, in these really weird ways. I mean, it's actually hard to remember life during COVID, and it's hard to remember life before COVID in a certain way. It feels like there's been great changes in how we get together, how we speak with each other, this kind of thing. In terms of reading, I don't know. I'm not aware of studies of this, though they may well exist. I will say that this book was absolutely a COVID project. So I decided to write this the day that lockdown happened in Chicago, which was roughly March the 8th, 2020, something like that. And then just blitzed it. And as I said at one point, I'm usually an early modernist, so this is way off my usual terrain. And I just thought, well, there's going to be something interesting here. I'll give it 6 months. And one of the positive things about COVID was that Harty Trust opened up all of their records. Right, they basically decided they were going to ignore copyright for the duration, and so the vast majority of things that are quoted in the book are actually accessed by a Harty Trust because of that. So I was able to do things thanks to COVID that I wouldn't have been able to do if it hadn't been for COVID. So for me, it was actually for this particular project, it was a vital sort of enabling thing that COVID happened. And it was a kind of exhilarating thing, to go into something that you don't know about and just completely, go at it, hammer and tongs nonstop. So I went from scratch to getting the first draft in about 7 months. So I got the first draft in the day of the election in 2020, which was November the 3rd or something like that. And it also, so from March the roughly 10th to November the 3rd, it went from nothing to more or less finished. What then happened, and I thought you were going to mention this when you said this thing about the publishing industry, was of course it took a lot longer to work through the publishing industry and come out than it did to write, which is partly because of paper shortages, but it's also because of the whole sort of gumming up of the system that things like peer review now involve. Right, that system is really tottering. So there was a weird kind of temporality to it. It was very fast to research and write, and very slow for it to come through the publishing process. Not sure what else I'd say about that. I'm inclined to think there probably have been big changes in reading and reception and so forth produced by the COVID experience. I don't know. I don't really know what they are. But I'd be surprised if they didn't exist. And it will be a great somebody should be looking at that if they're not. I mean, to figure out what the changes have been.
Thank you very much for indulging me. We have gone through all of the questions. Last call if anyone has been sitting on anything. Otherwise, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. I'm really glad the weather cooperated and I didn't have to run to the basement at any point.
Oh, good. I'm glad you didn't have to flee some tornado as well. That would have been hair-raising.
Springtime in the Midwest for any distance viewers. Awesome. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Adrian for joining us. This has been a real pleasure. We will have this video uploaded to our YouTube channel probably in a week or two. We go through, we correct all of the weird auto generation transcripts to correct words. But I will be also sharing it on listserv so that people can see it. So Adrian, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Your book was incredible. Your lecture was incredible. And I hope to see you again sometime.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks very much. Thanks for everybody who joined in, and thanks for such great questions as well. Very thought-provoking. All right.
Have a great night, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks.